Hello. Hello to everyone out there. I'm Poetic Heretic, and today we are indeed continuing our analysis of Volume 2 of The Unknown Reality, a Seth book by Jane Roberts. As usual, I will be both reading and commenting on the material. All right, so everything looks good here. So let us, without further ado, get started. Appendix 18 for session 711. I'll open this appendix by referring to a pair of short notes I wrote for Volume 1 of Unknown Reality. First, Note 6, session 686, quote, "We're still acquiring information about the psychic connections between Jane and Seth, of course. Even now, more than 10 years after Jane began speaking for Seth, one might say that each session we hold represents another step in this learning process. We fully expect it to continue as long as the sessions do," end quote. Then, Note 3 for the 688th session contains my statement that in an appendix for session 711, quote, "I assemble from various sessions information on the complex relationships involving Jane Rupert Seth, and also Rob Joseph," end quote. Sometimes, though, I find it quite a challenge to excerpt a number of sessions to illuminate a particular one. I want the passages chosen to make sense on their own, out of context, and to focus clearly on the subject. At the same time, I don't want to include too many or too few of my own notes, but in this appendix at least, I discovered that it wasn't always possible to achieve both of those goals just as I wanted to, not in connection with each point mentioned. It also became inevitable that at least some elements of Seth's own quote-unquote separate but connected reality would have to be considered. In addition to those concerns, on occasion I found myself rearranging the quoted discussions a bit, although really to a minor degree, for even greater brevity and clarity. So here's how it all worked out. This appendix was inspired by 2 blocks of material Seth covered in the 711th session. Jane's hearing his voice recently in the sleep state, see your own notes at the start of the 710th session, and the bridge personalities she and Seth have created quote-unquote between dimensions, or between themselves. I finally decided that the best way to present the variety of material desired, whether from Seth, Jane, or myself, was in chronological order, letting a composite picture emerge as the work progresses. This system automatically makes room for any references in Volume 1. In actuality, the chronology begins long before Unknown Reality was started, and continues well beyond the date of its ending, in April 1975. Since the excerpts are still more representative than complete, however, due to the accumulated mass of information available, my own choices enter in. ESP class data are quoted a number of times. Included is material summarizing Jane's own theories about the Seth phenomena, as she worked them out in her recently completed Adventures in Consciousness. But reincarnation, while mentioned often, isn't stressed in terms of particulars. That is, I refer to Seth's statements that he, Jane, and I led closely involved lives in Denmark in the 1600s, but those lives aren't studied per se. Within our ordinary context of linear time, I think of reincarnation, even though in Seth's terms it's really a simultaneous phenomenon, as being further away or more removed from us physical creatures than the more quote-unquote immediate psychic connections and mechanics I want to show as linking Seth, Jane, and myself. And also because of that sense of removal, Seth too is hardly mentioned at all. Footnote. Jane discussed Seth 2 rather often in Adventures. I do plan to write at least briefly about Seth 2 in another appendix for this Volume 2 of Unknown Reality. However, the idea being that such material can be taken as an extension of the Jane Rupert Seth study presented here. And added later, the opportunity to do so developed much sooner than I thought it would. Only a week after the 711th session was held, see Appendix 19 for session 712. End of footnote. Perhaps I put this appendix together as I did partly because Jane herself isn't much turned on by reincarnational concepts, although she does like the way Seth insists upon the unlimited attributes of each personality, and within a quote-unquote simultaneous framework, there's plenty of room for probable selves, reincarnational selves, and, added later, counterpart selves. Footnote. Seth began his material on counterpart selves late next month in the 721st session. Out of that session grew Appendix 21. The material in Appendix 18, then, is intended to further enrich the counterpart information in session 721, as well as in its appendix. End of footnote. Seth began talking about his connections with Rupert Jane, and therefore himself and his own reality, almost from the time these sessions began on December 2nd, 1963. Such relationships were of great interest to us as we sought to understand the blossoming of Jane's psychic abilities. They still are. Every bit of information helped, although often in the beginning I didn't know enough to follow up answers with more questions. As the sessions multiplied, however, this became more and more difficult to do. There was a steadily widening pool of material to ask questions about. I'll begin our chronology by reminding the reader that Note 6 for session 711 contains a description of how, through the Ouija board, Seth announced himself by that name in the 4th session for December 8th. Note 6 also includes his reasoning about names as given a decade later. Then, in the 6th session, Seth's answer to my question, "Do you have a last name?" couldn't have been more precise. No. I still think his reply has its own kind of wit, even though it came to us through the board. Footnote. In Chapter 3 of the Seth material, Jane describes our use of the Ouija board in the early sessions. In the 8th session for December 15th, 1963, she began dictating portions of each session. By the 14th session, she was delivering verbally all of Seth's material except for an opening remark or two obtained through the board. A month after that, we dispensed with the board entirely. End of footnote. Speaking of names, this is the time to remind all that Seth calls both Jane and me by male names, Rupert and Joseph. Why does he speak of Jane as a male and so as he and him? In Note 6 for session 679 in Volume 1, I quoted Seth from the 12th session for January 2nd, 1964. And here is the quote. "Sex, regardless of all your fleshy tales, is a psychic phenomenon, merely certain qualities which you call male and female. The qualities are real, however, and permeate other planes as well as your own. They are opposites which are nevertheless complementary, and which merge into one. When I say, as I have, that the overall entity, or whole self, is neither male nor female, and yet refer to some entities by definite male names, such as Rupert and Joseph, I merely mean that in the overall essence, the given entity identifies itself more with the so-called male characteristics than with the female." Sessions 12 through 15 are briefly quoted in Note 4 for the 680th session in Volume 1. Seth remarked upon the impossibility of closed systems, his own senses, including something of their limits, his ability to visit other quote-unquote planes of reality, and his quote-unquote incipient man's form. However, from session 14 for January 8th, 1964, there's other material that can be given here, as well as some that makes an interesting note at the end of this appendix. Footnote. That's a long footnote, so I'll need a drink of water first. In the 14th session, Seth came through with some very valuable remarks about his concepts of time. Quote, "It is therefore still a reality of some kind to me," end quote, for instance. Because I've always thought those insights well worth repeating, I quoted them in the introduction for Volume 1, and added later following session 724 in Volume 2. Now let me further excerpt Seth from that 14th session. Quote, "You mentioned earlier, Joseph, that you had the feeling I could refer back to myself almost as if I could turn a later page of a book to an earlier one. And of course this is the case," end quote, with a smile. "Viewing a historical moment through your marvelous television, you can refer to much that is past. But 1 minute of such a referral costs you 1 minute of present time. Also, you end up shortchanged. You give up your precious moment in the present, but you do not have a underlined complete, my emphasis, moment in the past to show for it. When I refer back to myself, I do not expend an identical moment of time in doing so." End of footnote. First, from my own note at 11:05, quote, "Jane said that Seth was quite pleased with the new voice, and that she now knows what he's thinking sometimes, even though he doesn't relay it to or through her as part of a message." Then from Seth himself, "In one sense, meeting with you costs me little energy, it is true. On the other hand, the effort to communicate explanations does involve a very real endeavor on my part, and so you are not the only ones who grow weary in this respect. As I have said, feeling is action, and in my communications to you, feeling plays a strong part. Nor did Seth agree with Jane's assessment of her reactions to her Seth voice. He was very outspoken, yet his material came through with a much lighter touch than these printed words alone can indicate. Rupert's voice sounds rather dreary in this transitional phase, yet the one thing that pleases me immensely is the way he can translate at least a few of my humorous remarks and the inflections of my natural speech. As a man's voice, I fear he will sound rather unmelodious. I do not have the voice of an angel by any means, but neither do I sound like an asexual eunuch, which is all I've been able to make him sound like all night. And incidentally, Rupert, you were a good brother at one time. The so-called male aspect of your personality has always been strong, but by this I mean powerful. Without the loyalty that you are learning as a woman, your character had many defects, and there, I said I would not get into anything serious. Then, to me, later yet in the session, and as a woman, when I knew you, you certainly put your present wife to shame as far as vanity was concerned. Seth with his humorous comments. I love it. From the 22nd session for February 4th, 1964, I have never trusted the written word half as much as I trust the spoken word, and on your plane it is difficult to trust either. But I do not feel that I could be myself as easily by means of automatic writing. For example, I do not mind speaking through Rupert's mouth. Somehow the sound of the words is rather pleasant. But seeing myself transformed more or less into plain black and white words on a sheet of paper seems dull and uninteresting. And I have always enjoyed conversation, which is the liveliest of all arts. Because Rupert deals in words as a writer, it's easy for me to communicate in this manner. That is, he automatically translates inner data given by me into coherent, valid, and faithful camouflage patterns into words. Footnote. See Note 2 for Appendix 12. End of footnote. My information is not actually given as sound. Its transference is instantaneous on Rupert's part, and is performed through the workings of the mind, the inner senses, and the brain. Footnote. By the time the 22nd session was held, Seth had mentioned the inner senses upon occasion, but had given us a breakdown on just the first one, inner vibrational touch. Consciously, then, we had no way of appreciating what important and interesting parts those, quote, senses leading to an inner reality, end quote, were to play in the material over the years. In chapter 19 of the Seth material, Jane quoted Seth on the 9 inner senses he's described so far. I should note that Jane's own use of that first inner sense, demonstrated in the example she gives in chapter 19, reflects a very strong facet of her psychic ability that she seldom indulges. Her reluctance here is closely connected to her deep feelings about personal privacy. End of footnote. That, of course, makes a lot of sense with Jane having been a sun sign Taurus. In Note 3 for the 688th session in Volume 1, I quoted my own note from the 24th session for February 10th, 1964. I described how Jane could sense the whole of whatever concept Seth was discussing, and how, since such a structure was too much for her to handle at once, she could feel Seth, quote, withdrawing it to release it to her a little at a time in the form of connected words, end quote. Then Seth himself continued in that 24th session. Concepts fit together in patterns. In order for there to be communication between us, I must disentangle a concept from its pattern, which is somewhat difficult. It is somewhat like having to free a particular word from a strong emotional association. I experience patterns made up of concepts, and you use words in associations. When I speak through Rupert, I must disentangle the concept. This sometimes leaves me with short ends, because it is natural for me to experience the concepts in their entirety, and yet I must drop very important data by the wayside because you are not capable of handling it, except in consecutive form. I underlined feel concept patterns. Footnote. For some related material on patterns and probabilities, see Note 13 for Appendix 12. End of footnote. From the 27th session for February 19th, 1964. There is so much I want to say. When your training is further advanced, underlined much further advanced, we may be able to take certain shortcuts. It is difficult for me to have to string out this material in words, and for you to record it. You see, it is possible in theory for you to experience directly a concept essence of the material in any given night session. Footnote. Even 11 years later, I'm certainly far away from experiencing the concept essence of any given session, as Seth suggests may be possible. I'm expressing contradictory beliefs, obviously, but it seems unlikely that I can use my abilities in such a fashion, even though I tell myself I'd like to. I do believe, however, that on occasion Jane has known a stepped-up awareness that almost equates with Seth's concept essence. One such instance is described in Appendix 7 for Volume 1, her reception of the material for a book called The Way Toward Health. At that time, she tuned into a different, quote-unquote, neurological speed, a faster one, so that much of the book was available to her at once. Jane's pleasure at having the ability was strongly tempered, therefore, while she, quote, could feel the bulk and immediacy of the book, end quote, as I quoted her in Appendix 7, she was, quote, also frustrated that what I've got down is so little and sketchy when it's already here. And those words are in all capitals. When it's already here. If I could have immediately spoken the whole thing, it would have been done at once. I can't tell you how frustrated, how blocked this made me feel at the time, end quote. In Volume 1, see the material on neurological speeds in Session 686. In Appendix 5 for the same session, see Jane's own notes on that subject. End of footnote. As for another advancement made, besides dispensing with the material Ouija board, Rupert has achieved a state in which he can receive inner data from me more readily, but beyond this, he is now able in some small way to contact me. One reason for the success of our communications is the peculiar abilities in you both and the interaction between them, and the use that you allow me to make of them. Rupert's intellect had to be of high quality. His conscious and unconscious mind had to be acquainted with certain ideas to begin with, in order for the complexity of this material to come through. In the beginning, for example, there is always a distortion of material by the person who receives it, at least on the topmost subconscious level. So an individual whose personal prejudices are at a minimum is excellent. If, for example, Rupert's prejudices happen to lie along lines which do not contradict what I know to be true, then all the better, and there is much less resistance. Information like this underlined is sifted through many layers of subconscious conception and is subsequently colored. People believing in your organized religions color it in a manner that is highly disadvantageous, and that unfortunately adds to existing superstitions. Rupert's mind, believe it or not, is much like my own, though, if you'll forgive me, in a very limited fashion. Therefore, the distortions are much less distortive, much less harmful, and more easily discovered and cleared. Others less perfectionist than myself are content with more distortion. I am not. Rupert's idea construction was rather amazing. Footnote. Jane produced her manuscript, The Physical Universe as Idea Construction, 3 months before the sessions began. That key event is briefly described in Volume 1. See Note 7 for Session 679. End of footnote. The inner senses provided him with much, but nevertheless the ideas in it represented an achievement of the conscious mind. I was drawn by this to realize that he was ready for me. To me, later in the session and with much humor, you had no problems with parents in the past, and, my dear Yo-Yo, you were an excellent father to me at one time, and if I may say so, at one time I was an excellent father to you. As a son, you were helpful, considerate, and kind. To me, this, reincarnational and family material, is also obvious that I almost hesitate to mention it, but this is because I tend to forget what human existence on your plane actually involves. This is still Seth talking, if you can't tell. And now, most devoted friends, a fond good evening. I will always help you to the best of my ability, and as far as I know, I will be accessible for your present lifetimes. Footnote. Well, obviously, it's true so far at least that Seth will be, quote-unquote, accessible for the present lifetimes of Jane and me. End of footnote. And my dear Joseph, if you whacked me many times, I got my blows in too, and I made Rupert one lovely wife. So there, my lovelies. Oh boy. All right, I'm going to take a sip of water real quick. From the 28th session for February 24th, 1964. As far as Rupert is concerned, there is no danger to him in these sessions. For one thing, I am an extremely sensitive but disciplined and sensible if somewhat irascible gentleman, if you will forgive the term. None of the communications for me have been in any way conducive to a development toward mental or emotional instability. Smiling. I may make bold to remark that I am more stable than you or Rupert, or your fine psychologist who just wrote to you. Footnote. In this appendix, I'm quoting certain portions of the 28th session to make certain points. In Chapter 5 of the Seth material, however, Jane presented much longer excerpts from the same session in order to explain her own views. End of footnote. I also do not take my responsibility lightly, and to a great degree I feel responsible for you, and for any results coming from your communications with me. If anything, the personal advice I have given you both should add to your mental and emotional balance, and result in a stronger relationship with the outside world. I do depend upon Rupert's willingness to dissociate. Footnote. When Jane began speaking for Seth, we checked out the definitions for concepts like dissociation, trance, and so forth, without being particularly influenced by what we found. We merely thought the meanings given were quite incomplete, so we decided to go our own collective way. As the sessions progressed, we came to understand that for Jane, dissociation simply meant her ability to direct an intense concentration towards certain highly creative goals, Seth in the sessions, so that we could learn from them. Her quote-unquote psychic accomplishments grew outside the session framework too, of course, as can be seen in much of the appendix material in Volume 1, to mention those examples only. And so to varying degrees, dissociation, or that strong power of concentration, entered into those activities. End of footnote. There is no doubt that at times he is unaware of his surroundings during a session. However, this is no more binding upon him than autosuggestion. It is a phenomenon in which he gives consent, and he could, at any time and in a split second, return his conscious attention upon his physical environment. There is no danger, and I will repeat this, there is no danger of dissociation grabbing a hold of him like some black, vague, and furry monster, carrying him away to the netherlands of hysteria, schizophrenia, or insanity. Withdrawal into dissociation as a hiding place from the world could, of course, have dire consequences. Certain personalities could and have fallen prey here. But with you, with Rupert, this is not the case. Also, Rupert has experienced and used dissociation, though to a lesser degree, before our communications, that is, in his work, and knows how to handle it. We have gone into this before, and I have no doubt that we will on endless occasions. And if I succeed in convincing you of my reality as a personality, I will have done extremely well. Rupert's subconscious has enough camouflage pattern to enable me to make contact, but not so much as to distort me out of all recognition. I am not his subconscious, though I speak through it. It is the atmosphere through which I can come to you, as the air is the atmosphere through which the bird flies. A certain reassembly of myself is necessary when I enter your plane, and this is done partially by myself, and by the combined subconscious efforts of you, Joseph, and Rupert. Will this satisfy you for now? Sure, Seth, I said, agreeing with the implication that Jane and I would want the same material discussed again and again. Footnote. Following his comments about his reassembly and our reality, Seth went into some analogous material in that 28th session that I've always wanted to see published. In part, then, quote, condensed time is the time felt or experienced by the entity, while any of its given personalities, quote unquote, live. And you had better put that in quotes, on a plane of physical materializations. To go into this a bit further, many men have said that life was a dream. They were true to the facts in one strong regard, and yet far afield as far as the main issue is concerned. Individual life, or the life of the present individual, could be legitimately compared to the dream of an entity. While the individual suffers and enjoys his or her given number of years, these are but a flash to the entity. The entity is concerned with such years in the same manner that you are concerned with your own dreams. And as your dreams originate with you, arise from you, attain a seeming independence, and have their ending with you, so an entity's personalities arise from it, attain various degrees of independence, and return to it, underlined, while never leaving it for an instant. The entity organizes its personalities and to some extent directs their activities while still allowing them what you would call free will. There exists infinities of diversity and opportunity for the personalities. The entity itself does not have to keep constant check on its personalities, because in each one there is an inner self-conscious part that knows its origin. I have mentioned before that some part of you knows exactly how much oxygen the lungs breathe, and how much energy it takes to pace a floor, and this is the part of you of which I spoke. It is the self-conscious part that receives all inner data. The part that translates inner data sifts it down through the subconscious, which is a barrier and also a threshold to the present camouflage personality. I have said that the topmost part of the subconscious contains personal memories, that beneath these are racial memories, and so forth. Things are simply not layered in the way I speak of them, but continuing with the necessary analogy, on the other side of, or beneath to you, the racial memories, you no longer exist within your plane. You look out upon another with the face of this other self-conscious part of you. This part receives inner data, is in contact with the entity to some greater degree than you are in contact with your dreams, and actually directs all of the important functions that you think are either automatically or unconsciously controlled. When such abilities as telepathy occur, this telepathic function is carried on continually by this other self-conscious part of you, but as a rule, you act upon those data without the knowledge of the conscious self with which you are familiar. With a laugh, there is, of course, an apparent contradiction here, but it is only apparent. Your dilemma being this: if you have another self-conscious self, underlined, then why aren't you aware of it? Pretend that you are some weird creature with two faces. One face looks out upon one world and one looks out upon another. Imagine, further, this poor creature having a brain to go with each face, and that each brain interprets reality in terms of the world it looks upon. Yet the worlds are different, and more, the creatures are Siamese twins. At the same time, imagine that these creatures are really one creature, but with definite parts equipped to handle two entirely different worlds. The subconscious, therefore, in this ludicrous analogy, would exist between the two brains and would enable the creature to operate as a single unit. At the same time, and this is the difficult part to explain, neither of the two faces would ever see the other world. They would not usually be aware of each other, and yet each would be fully self-conscious. End quote. End of footnote. And Rupert did get a rather embarrassing flash from me before the session. I blush to admit the fact, but at one time I did call you Yo-Yo. See the excerpts for the 27th session. When did you call me that, Seth? I called you Yo-Yo when you were my father, and I am not going into any reincarnational material tonight. I guess that's the end of that excerpt. From the 33rd sin for March 9th, 1964. I do not bring about the trance state in the manner of which you, Joseph, are speaking. Rupert switches on another channel, through which my essence can enter more readily. This certainly does involve a looking inward on his part, but it is not self-hypnosis in usual terms, merely a focusing upon an objective inner stimulus. Any such signs, as the powerful, deeper Seth voice, involve camouflage patterns and do not actually represent direct experience. This is not my voice, for example. It is a representation or approximation of my voice for your edification. Furthermore, in your terms, I do not have a voice, but it is a valid representation, and if I say so myself, that's a pun. The voice is much like the one I would use. From the 49th session for April 29th, 1964, it is much better in the long run to quietly and cautiously advance in these sessions. I am not the Holy Ghost. I do not require or demand the vows of poverty, obedience, and certainly not chastity. I will at all times demand integrity, and perhaps when all is said and done, that is my underlined only requirement. Then to a friend of ours, both were present and among the few to witness a session up to that time, excess enthusiasm can lead to fanaticism, and this at all costs must be avoided. From the 54th session for May 18th, 1964, your Rupert was, indeed, Seth. I have promised to give you more material dealing with the psychic construction of the entity and its relationship with its various physical personalities. In the beginning, I could not tell you in so many words that Rupert is myself, because you would have leapt to the conclusion that I was Rupert's subconscious mind, and this is not so. Rupert is underlined not myself underlined now in his present life. He is nevertheless an extension and materialization underlined of the Seth that I was at one time. Nothing remains unchanging, entities and personalities least of all. You cannot stop them in time. I am Seth. I keep my continuity, but I change, and offshoots like currents explode into being. Rupert was myself, Seth, many centuries ago, but underlined he grew, evolved, and expanded in terms of a particular personal set of value fulfillments. He is now a personality that was one of the underlined probable personalities into which Seth could grow. Footnote. Seth discussed many facets of his concept of probabilities in Volume 1, of course. In Volume 2, see Note 16 for Appendix 12. End of footnote. Underlined I represent another. Underlined I am another. To make it simpler, we split, this being necessary always so that various possibilities can be brought into action. Yet we are bound together, and no invasion of Rupert occurs because, in one way of speaking, our psychic territory is the same. From the 58th session for June 1st, 1964, Rupert and myself are offshoots of the same entity. And by the way, I want to say before I forget, the Kindle app has informed me by this point that we have about 2 hours of this very appendix remaining. So it looks like the entirety of this stream will actually just be the material in Appendix 18, which focuses mainly around Seth describing his reality and similar subjects. So yes, Rupert and myself are offshoots of the same entity. The difference in time is but a camouflage distortion. The entity was a particularly strong one, and many of its egos have made the decision to turn into entities. And now, my dear patient Joseph, may I tell you that you are also part of that same entity, and underlined this is one of the reasons why I am able to communicate with you both. From the 82nd session for August 27th, 1964. When man realizes that he creates his own image underlined now, he will not find it so startling to believe that he creates other images in other times. Only after such a basis is established will the idea of reincarnation achieve its natural validity, and only when it is understood that the subconscious, certain layers of it, is a link between the present personality and past ones, will the theory of reincarnation be accepted as fact. From the 83rd session for August 31st, 1964. Man sees not even half of the whole entity which is himself. It is true that on this journey, with the sessions, discipline, some caution and understanding, and much courage is demanded. This is as it should be. I am helping you in this. You are both, meaning Jane and me, peculiarly suited for such a pursuit, with a combination of intuitiveness, basic psychic facility, and yet integrated inner identities. I also want to add that I am underlined not a control, as mediums speak of controls. I am not, as I believe I have mentioned, a secondary or split personality of Rupert's. For example, I am not a conglomeration of male tendencies that have collected themselves into a subsidiary personality that struggles for recognition or release. I say that I am an energy personality essence, since that is what I am. My name for him is Rupert, which happens to be a male name simply because it is the closest translation, in your terms, for the name of the whole self or entity of which he is now a self-conscious part. Foot. In Volume 1, see Note 3 for Session 679. End of footnote. From the 119th session for January 6th, 1965, Rupert should learn much of advantage from the book by Young, which he is reading. Footnote. Memories, Dreams, Reflections by C.G. Young, copyright 1961 by Random House Incorporated, New York, New York. End of footnote. And I would like to mention here that I am not underlined Jane's animus, nor could I possibly live up to Jane's animus. I use the name Jane here rather than Rupert because the animus belongs to Jane and to the present personality. Talk about reflections, because underlined Rupert has an anima. Footnote. For many readers, Seth's remarks about the anima and the animus will require a bit of explaining. Carl Jung, 1875 to 1961, the Swiss psychologist and psychiatrist, postulated that the unconscious of the male contains a female, archetypal or typical instinctive figure called the anima. The correlative male form in the unconscious of the female, Jung called the animus. Yes, and I have to say that I think for many people who are predisposed to being interested in watching this stream or streams like this, the one that we're doing now, will have a high probability, or at least a fairly high probability, I would think, of being familiar with Jung's work and the terms of anima and animus. In fact, I have come across the anima and animus numerous times throughout my various research. I think even just recently, I think I came across it in Dane Rudyard's The Astrology of Personality, which I'm currently reading and studying about 1/3 of the way through it, and it gets into a lot of primer material on like psychology and philosophy. I guess probably in part because Dane Rudyard himself, I believe, was a psychologist in addition to an astrologer before it gets to the actual astrology in the book. It's like you have to go through a huge primer that I don't know about other people, but for me is going to take me is taking me like 2-3 months to read just that, and then you finally get to the astrology. But anyway, yeah, anima and animus is a term I've come across repeatedly, interestingly enough. It's also in the name of Lacuna Coil's latest album, Black Anima, but I think it's used in a different context there. It's used to, well, from what I've read anyway, in that context, to refer to the soul more so than anything else, the specific term anima, that is. Anyway, or that would be the closest translation. In session 119, then, Seth comments on how Jane herself has an animus, the hidden male within, and on how Rupert, that larger quote-unquote male entity of which she is a quote-unquote self-conscious part, contains an anima, or hidden female. See the excerpts in this appendix from the 83rd session. The contrasts are most interesting. From this information, I infer that the entity or whole self of each of us, regardless of our current individual sexual orientation, contains its own counterbalancing male or female quality, whichever the case may be. Seth hasn't said so yet, nor have we asked him, but I suspect that an energy gestalt like the entity is much more aware than we can be of its quote-unquote hidden opposite sex form or forms, for there may be many of them. Below, I'll quote very short passages from sessions 555 through 56 and chapter 13 of Seth Speaks, while referring the reader to them at the same time, then present some additional material from the 83rd session that I saved for this note, since in it Seth discussed the theories of both Jung and Jung's famous teacher, Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939. Turning the heater down a bit, it's a little warm in here. In Seth Speaks, Seth developed Jung's ideas about the anima and the animus by stating that such other sex qualities or personifications within each of us actually represent memories of past lives. Jung himself thought the questions of reincarnation and of karma, or roughly destiny or fate, to be quote unquote obscure. He couldn't be sure of the existence of such phenomena. Interesting. I read recently in that Dane Rudyard book that Jung, if I'm remembering this correctly, Jung saw the belief in what was it? Like some kind of afterlife, I think, as necessary for psychological health. Like, don't quote me on that, but I'm 99% sure that's what I read. That Jung saw the belief in some kind of afterlife as necessary for psychological health, interestingly enough. Okay, so where were we? From session 555 for October 21st, 1970, quote, "The anima and the animus are highly charged psychically and also appear in the dream state. They operate as compensations and reminders to prevent you from over-identifying yourself with your present physical body." And from session 556, "The reality of the anima and the animus is far deeper than Jung supposed. Symbolically speaking, the two together represent the whole self with its diverse abilities, desires, and characteristics. Personality, as you know it, cannot be understood unless the true meaning of the anima and the animus is taken into consideration." That's very interesting. Seth said, "The two together represent the whole self with its diverse abilities, desires, and characteristics." Wasn't the whole concept around the anima and animus, according to Jung, that one had to basically make it conscious, like make whatever one had within them conscious in order to achieve like self-realization, or to be, I don't know. Unfortunately, my memory's a bit blurry on this, but I remember coming across that before. Anyway, two notes in connection with the excerpts from the 83rd session. Well, the point I was making with what I said just a little bit ago, though, before I forget, is just that would very much seem to agree with what Seth is saying. Like, that would seem to go hand in hand with what Seth is saying. Okay, two notes in connection with the excerpts from the 83rd session. One, the famous professional break between Freud and the younger Jung occurred in 1931. Seth's material touches upon the divergent psychological paths taken by each of them. Two, the libido is regarded as the sexual urge or instinct, positive, loving, psychic energy that shows itself in changing ways as the individual matters, or as the individual matures. As the individual matures. Okay, but this, yes, but a distinction here needs to be made, because like I said, I've come across some of this Jungian material before, and I've in fact studied a bit, just a very tiny amount, unfortunately. I intend to get into a more one of these days once I finally get through some other books, but I have studied a tiny sliver of Jung's psychology of the unconscious, I believe it was. And in that, it was specifically pointed out that the term libido was used not so much in a sexual context, but to mean more of, like, if I'm recalling this correctly, an inner drive, like that which drives us, that which drives us, that which motivates us, that which makes us want to do things, like the energy that makes us want to do things, and like the life force within us, essentially. That was how Jung was using libido, if I do recall correctly. But I definitely remember a distinction between that and the idea of the sexual urge, which people typically associate with the word libido. So let that be considered here. Now, I don't recall if Freud also used it in that way, or did that originate with Freud? I don't think so. I remember it was in Jung's Psychology of the Unconscious that I read that. So I don't know, but there you have it. Seth, quote, "There are a few points of a general nature that I would like to make. Rupert has been reading Jung, though not consistently. The libido does underlined not originate in the subconscious of the present personality. It begins instead in the energy of the entity and inner self, and is directed by means of the inner senses, outward, so to speak, through the deeper layers of the individual subconscious mind, then through the outer or personal areas. Your Freud and Jung have probed into the personal subconscious. Jung saw glimpses of other depths, but that is all. There are rather unfortunate distortions occurring in his writings, as well as in Freud's, since they did not understand the primary cooperative nature of the libido. We have spoken of the biological interdependence and cooperation among organisms in your physical universe. The appearance of an individual into the physical realm is aided by the psychic collaboration of individuals on your plane. Almost at once, the new libido takes up its adopted duty of maintaining the physical universe, along with all others. If it did not do so, it would not exist for long. Cooperation on underlined all levels is the necessity on all planes. I was somewhat concerned with Rupert's reading of Jung, simply because while Jung seems to offer more than Freud, in some aspects he has attempted much and his distortions are fairly important. Seeming to delve further and offering many significant results, Jung nevertheless causes conclusions, all the more hampering because of his scope." Yeah, it's interesting reading Dane Rudyard's book in recent times. He has I guess some criticisms of Jung, or some, I don't know. There was some verbiage that I came across earlier in the book that made me go like, "Oh wow, he's really kind of like, I mean, he's almost in modern terminology like sort of throwing shade towards Jung." It almost sounded like, or really disagreeing with Jung's concepts. But I could try to look it up, but unfortunately, I couldn't for the life of me recall what it was that Rudyard was disagreeing with in Jung's concept. But I thought, interesting, because for so much of the rest of the book that I've read, and like I said, I've read about 1/3 of it so far, and it's quite the dense book. He like largely praises Jung. He agrees with Jung so much, and this is like one of the most famous of all, and like exemplary of all modern astrologers, is Dane Rudyard. So anyway, it is true that the outward manifestations of the libido are directed toward the physical world, but until its source is seen, underlined not in the topmost subconscious layers of the individual, and not even in the racial subconscious, but within the entity itself, then man will not know himself. Basically, Jung feared such a journey because he felt that it led only to the racial source, that anyone involved in such a study would end up in the bottleneck of a first womb. But underlined there is an opening up into other realms, through which the libido also passed. Figuratively speaking, it squeezed itself through the bottleneck, and there is a lack of limitation on the other side. Freud courageously probed into the individual topmost layers of the subconscious and found them deeper than even he suspected. These levels are indeed filled with what may be termed life-giving, differentiated, and undifferentiated impulses acquired in the present life of an individual. But when these have been passed, there are many discoveries still to be made. After that passage, the diligent, consistent, intuitive, and flexible seeker after knowledge will find horizons of which Freud never dreamed. Freud merely touched the outer boundaries. Jung, with his eyes clouded by the turmoil set up by Freud, glimpsed some further regions, but poorly. End quote. End of footnote. Scientists have glimpsed the complications of the human body. They have scarcely glimpsed the complicated realities of the mind. That was Seth, and now in parentheses, Jane's account of quote-unquote a year of testing Seth's and her own psychic abilities is given in chapters 6 through 8 of the Seth material. The test began with the 179th session for August 18th, 1965, and finally ended with the 310th session for January 9th, 1967, although actually most of them were held during the year following their inception. All that work can't be described here, but we accomplished our main goal, exploring from new angles the relationships involving Jane, Seth, and our physical camouflage reality. The test concerned two main approaches. The first, for our own study, was for Seth to describe objects thoroughly sealed in double envelopes. The envelopes were prepared, unknown to Jane, of course, by myself and by others. The second was for Seth to give long-distance impressions on a regular basis about the reality of an eminent elderly psychologist at an Eastern university. We met, quote-unquote, Dr. Instream, as Jane called him in the Seth material. But once, a few weeks after I'd written him in the spring of 1965 about Jane's growing psychic abilities. Wait, so what's that saying? Okay, we met this guy but once, a few weeks after I'd written him in the spring of 1965 about Jane's growing psychic abilities. Okay. Seth conducted 83 envelope tests for Jane and me, and within a concentrated period of 9 months during that quote-unquote year of testing, gave impressions for Dr. Instream on 75 occasions. Those I mailed to the doctor as they came through. Footnote. As Jane wrote in Chapter 8 of the Seth material, the in-stream tests were very unsatisfactory for us. Since we were informed as to their results, we were left with no way to judge what proportions of Seth's impressions could be considered hits, near misses, or failures. Our 9-month involvement under those conditions revealed both our naivete at the time and our stubbornness in trying to learn. But learn we did, if not always as we'd expected to. For besides gaining valuable insights into Seth Jane's abilities through our own envelope tests, we discovered much through our dealings with at least some kinds of quote-unquote authority. Overall, the affair of the tests was most instructive. End of footnote. Often both tests were held during each of our twice-weekly sessions. Here's what Seth said after that first, only moderately successful envelope test had taken place in the 179th session. We are dealing here with something rather unusual, the tests, in that we are attempting to permit two personalities to exist side by side, so to speak. Rupert is not in a deep trance state. I do not supersede his own personality. He, underlined, allows me in our sessions to coexist with himself. A deeper trance state would allow us to get less distorted information on such a test as this initially, but our results will improve, and such experiments will be helpful in that the various layers of the two personalities, Rupert's and my own, will be seen in their operating procedures. Rupert will learn very quickly through such practice. The distortions that appeared are most helpful, in that they allow Rupert to differentiate between my own communications and his own thoughts. From the 180th session for August 23rd, 1965. Tonight's second envelope test dealt with clairvoyance. I happened to pick up my information that way, although it could just as easily have been obtained through telepathic communication. Footnote. Seth commented upon some of his own quote-unquote psychic abilities when I asked him if he telepathically acquired any information about the test object from me, since I was the one who had chosen it, rather than from the object itself. The results of the second envelope test were obviously more precise than for the first one. At break, I told Jane that she'd done well. We were very encouraged. Two quick reminders. 1. Clairvoyance, clear seeing, is the paranormal perception of events or objects regardless of distance and without help from another mind. 2. Telepathy is the communication of thoughts or emotions between minds, regardless of distance. In actuality, it's often difficult to tell whether clairvoyance, telepathy, or both operated in a given instance. Nor am I noting here how the use of these phenomena may be connected to the perception of the past or future. End of footnote. In the future, tests will be worked out in whatever manner is needed. I myself operate well clairvoyantly, for my own reasons and peculiarities, and usually obtain such information in that manner. We will have much to say concerning the ways in which that kind of material is received and interpreted, as that is very important. From the 211th session for November 24th, 1965. First of all, as far as the hands are concerned, to be left or right-handed has to do with inner mechanisms and brain patterns that come first, before the motions of the hands. Characteristically underlined, I operated in certain manners that resulted in the primary use of my left hand when I was focused within physical matter. Now and then with Rupert, when I am allowed to manifest myself to a smaller or lesser degree, my own habits therefore show through, for I manipulate his muscles in a different way than he does. But, scientifically, this would not be proof of my existence as an independent personality who has survived physical death. Not that this concerns me, for it does not. Or, if you are thinking in terms of secondary personalities, you can prove nothing one way or another. Footnote. In this appendix, the presentations from sessions 28 and 83 contain Seth's comments as to whether he's, quote, a secondary or split personality of Rupert's, end quote, to quote him from the latter. Correction. On her own, Jane expressed concern about secondary personalities. In Chapter 6 of the Seth material, see her account of our meetings with Dr. Instream. Additional related material can be found in Chapter 2 of The Coming of Seth, and in the sessions dealing with Augustus in Chapter 6 of Personal Reality. End of footnote. A secondary personality could indeed use gestures that are different from Rupert's. Either way, this would be no proof as to my independent nature. With humor, I am glad to see that it has not... Correction. I am glad to see that it has been bothering you. You have had a good think session. Seth came through with this material, including his jocular closing remarks, because a good friend of ours had asked many questions as he witnessed the session, one of them being why the right-handed Jane gestured mainly with her left hand while speaking in trance. I hadn't noticed this mannerism. It's of interest to add that, as far as she knows, Jane was born right-handed, yet does recall her mother saying that she, Jane, was originally left-handed and had been taught to switch handedness. Jane is sure she wasn't compelled to do so in school, say. At the same time, she laughed. In early grades, she had much trouble learning to salute the flag with her right hand. She repeatedly used her left hand until she, quote-unquote, learned better. Incidentally, it's been many years since she showed any signs of favoring either hand in trance. From the 242nd session for March 16th, 1966. The ego is not the most powerful or the most knowledgeable portion of the self. It is simply a well-specialized part of the personality, fully equipped to operate under certain circumstances. Footnote. In Volume 1, see Seth's material on man's emerging ego consciousness in session 686, after 1037, 687, 689, and Appendix 6. End of footnote. When those conditions no longer exist, after quote-unquote death, then other layers of the self take over the dominant position, and the personality realigns its psychological components. The ego does not, underlined, disappear, however. It merely takes a back seat in some respects, as your own subconscious does during physical existence. The ego is under the control of what may loosely be called the inner self. The survival or non-physical personality has the same relationship to the ego as the dreaming personality has to it in physical life. When communication takes place between a survival personality and one who exists within the physical system, this involves a reshuffling on the part of the survival personality, where the ego is momentarily given greater reign. If this was not done, then in most cases communication would not be possible, just because the survival personality would have such difficulty, underlined, impressing the personality who is still ego-oriented within the physical system. The non-physical personality does not think in terms of words, but experiences concepts in a much more direct manner. This sort of thing simply could not be understood by the physically focused individual. The survival personality's inner self gives this reassembled ego ideas in the same way that, often, the subconscious gives the ego concepts in physical existence. This reassembled ego then attempts to perceive these insights in terms of underlying sense perceptions, which are sent to the physical individual at the other end. Sometimes the communications are made directly, though they must be sifted through the subconscious of the one who is physical. When that person is trained along these lines, however, as Rupert is, he or she helps in this process, and a underlined psychological framework like a bridge is erected that serves to connect the two personalities. Footnote. I noted at the beginning of this appendix that it was inspired, at least in part, by the material Seth had given in the 711th session on the psychological bridge, or framework, linking Jane and himself. I refer the reader to those passages now. They start at 1140. Also see the last two paragraphs of the opening notes for session 705 in this volume, with note 2 for that session. Seth actually initiated his material on the psychological bridge in the last 241st session. However, I chose to excerpt the 242nd session on the subject because of the information it also contains on the ego and survival personalities in general. End of footnote. I speak as myself. I speak as my whole self to you. Since my personality structure is more advanced than is usual for communications from other systems, therefore, I do not need to adopt a past ego of my own. Perhaps because this is not necessary. The psychological bridge is required to make my messages comprehensible to Rupert. This connecting framework does some of the translating for me that a reassembled ego would do. It delivers information to Rupert in a way that he can understand. Occasionally, in your tests, I do impress him underlined directly, telepathically, see note 19, with a concept. When he receives data in the form of images, the framework is operating. With underlined my direction, this framework uses Rupert's personal associations to direct his impressions toward the correct point. Then when we are successful, I insert the right information. Footnote. The 241st session mentioned in note 22 is one of those we hope to publish in full, for in it Seth discussed how the psychological bridge helps Jane quote-unquote translate his telepathic material. The information came through in connection with our envelope tests and those for Dr. Instream, both sets of which were in mid-course then in March 1966. See the account of Jane's year of testing and the excerpts from sessions 179 through 80. Here are a few insights from Seth's material in the 241st session. Quote, this psychological framework is in itself capable of growth. It represents on Rupert's part an expansion, and indeed on my own part also. It is formed partially by abilities inherent within all personalities, psychic abilities, and it is composed of energy. It is not a secondary personality, for it exists in quite a different dimension than do secondary personalities. The psychological bridge can transmit, you see, and to some extent translate, but not interpret. I am dependent in a large measure upon Rupert's own knowledge, and lack of it, and that I cannot force from him, from his speech mechanism, concepts with which he is underlined entirely unfamiliar. I must introduce them step by step, as I explained moment points, see note 11 for Appendix 12, to you. It is not as simple a thing as it might seem, for there is no coercion involved, Rupert always consenting to let me push concepts at him, which he interprets speech-wise with my assistance. In our experiments, often I will give him an impression, and he will automatically translate it into visual terms. There is sometimes at his end a last tug and pull, so that the vocal mechanism will finally speak the correct interpretation. Of course, Rupert's own associations are used by me up to a certain point to lead him to the proper subject or image. When we are successful, there is a divergence from his associations so that he says the underlined correct word, even though for him personally it may be the underlined wrong word. On Rupert's part, this can sometimes be disconcerting. We must always work with psychological organizations, however. The emotions always follow associated lines in this regard. The trick is to allow Rupert's associations free rein to a certain point, and then expertly insert the correct data. This is sometimes difficult. His associations may go, for example, from C, D, E, and F, but precisely where he would say G, we must insert X or Y, and do it so smoothly that he is quite unaware. He consents to let me underline use his associations in such a manner. End quote. End of footnote. I am a communicator. In our case, the control personality, so called, the psychological framework to which I have referred, is entirely passive and shall remain so. In the 263rd session from May 29th, 1966, Seth stated that eventually Jane would be able to entirely dispense with the psychological bridge linking the two of them, but she hasn't attained that situation at this writing. From the 398th session from March 11th, 1968. Personalities are not static things. Entities are eternal. They are not as nicely nor as neatly packaged out, one to a body, as your psychologists believe. They constantly change. They grow. They make decisions. They use the physical body fully, or they partially depart according to their own inner needs and development. When psychic gestalts are formed, they are not static. They make different alliances until they find their place in a whole identity that serves their purposes, or are strong enough to become indestructible. They are always underlined becoming. They are not closed units. To me, Rob. Now, I hope you will understand me intuitively, for what I have said tonight confounds the intellect to some considerable degree, but I speak through Rupert, and Rupert is himself, and I am myself, yet without your support of Rupert I could not speak. This in no way minimizes my reality, or Rupert's. The Seth 2 phenomenon began to manifest itself through Jane in the 406th session for April 22nd, 1968. Seth 2 exists in relation to Seth in somewhat the same manner that Seth does to Jane, although that analogy shouldn't be carried very far. Even though deep connections endure among the three, then, at the same time, as I wrote early in the study, Seth 2 is too far, quote-unquote, away from Jane and the subject matter of this appendix to go into here. See Note 1. Now I'll refer the reader to Chapter 20 of Jane's The Seth material. She called the chapter Personal Evaluations. Who or what is Seth? In it, she made a number of excellent points concerning her relationship with Seth and Seth 2. For example, quote, if physical life evolves in ordinary terms, why not consciousness itself? End quote. The questions we had at the time can be found throughout the chapter. Indeed, we still have many of them, or, I should note, we're still intrigued by the latest versions of those quote-unquote old questions, for like consciousness itself, they're endless in their ramifications. But here I want to call attention mainly to the excerpt in Chapter 20 that Jane presented from the 458th session for January 20th, 1969. Seth discussed the psychological bridge Jane and he have created between themselves for purposes of communication. Yet most of his material came through in response to my question about his availability to us. Quote, we, Rob and I, both know that some sessions seem more, quote-unquote, immediate than others. And now, as Seth continued, we saw why. Jane wrote in Chapter 20, Seth, briefly, from the 458th session. I am, however, automatically a part of the message that I bring to you. At times, I am, quote-unquote, here more completely than in other sessions. These reasons often have to do with circumstances usually beyond normal control, electromagnetic conditions, psychological circumstances. These could be considered as atmospheric conditions through which I must travel. As I have told you, projection is involved to some extent, both on my part and Rupert's. Your, Rob's, own presence is also important, whether or not you are present at any given session. Now, when you watch, say, educational television, you see the teacher, and he speaks. Actually, you may be watching a film. But the teacher exists whether or not he is speaking at that time, and his message is legitimate. It makes no difference whether or not I am myself speaking through Rupert now, or whether I did this last night in his sleep and tonight is a film or playback. Again, with a smile, the medium is the message. This does not mean that I use Rupert as a puppet and stuff his mouth with tapes as a recorder, that you are always listening to replays, or that emotionally I am not always with you in sessions. It means that in such multidimensional communications, more is involved than you suppose. All right, so I always avoid doing this as much as possible, but I do need a brief little break, so I will be back in 1 minute. Okay, and I am back. All right, so that was refreshing. I want to remind people, as long as we're taking a brief intermission here, that I am now regularly doing live tarot readings for donations of any amount every Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on this channel. And I typically do so, or I'm typically doing so now for 1 hour, so from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time, or longer if there's greater demand than that. So if you ever want a tarot reading, feel free to come by my channel Fridays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You can donate as little as $1, just $1, or the equivalent in your country's currency if you're not in the U.S. And I'll be happy to give you a tarot reading. And I'll even give you an astrology reading if you choose to donate $20 or more, an astrological consultation. All right. So with that out of the way, let us continue. Now here's an excerpt from the 458th session that wasn't given in chapter 20. It concerns witnesses asking questions of Seth during a session. It is unfortunate that I must use terms of time to explain all this to you, but as I told you many sessions ago, my time is not your time, humorously. Because you ask specific questions at a specific session, it does not necessarily mean that the program has not been prepared, in your terms, earlier. For on many occasions, I will see the questions within your mind, or the minds of your witnesses, and again, in your terms, will therefore answer them ahead of time. Even on such occasions, however, I look in on you closely to see whether or not my message is coming across clearly, and I also learn. Later in chapter 20 of the Seth material, Jane quoted Seth from the 463rd session for February 3rd, 1969. While discussing the impossibility of any medium being an absolutely clear channel for paranormal knowledge, even when, quote, in a trance as deep as the Atlantic Ocean, end quote, Seth had some extremely interesting things to say about the nature of perception in general. Presenting a few sentences from that session here serves two purposes. I can remind the reader of important material, and in note 24, I can offer some unpublished extensions of it from the next session. Information must be sifted through the layers of the medium's personality. Any perception instantly alters the electromagnetic and neurological systems of the perceiver. It is a logistic contradiction to imagine, with your physical systems, that any perception can be received without the perceiver's inner situation being altered. I'm trying to make it as clear as possible. Information automatically blends with, is intermingled with, and enmeshed with the entire physically valid structure of the personality. Any perception is action. It changes that upon which it acts, and underlined, in so doing, it is itself changed. The slightest perception alters every atom within your body. Footnote. In the 464th session, I made sure that I asked Seth to elaborate upon his statement in the last session. Quote, the slightest perception alters every atom within your body. He came through with his answer just before our first break. Returning to the material on perception, there are changes in the positive and negative atomic charges, alterations of movement inside the atoms and the smaller particles, a change in pulsation rate. The activity of atoms is actually caused by perceptive qualities. To begin with, atoms do not just move within themselves because they are atoms. The constant motion within them is caused by the unending perceptive nature of any consciousness, however minute in your terms. Does that answer your question? Yes, I said, but I could ask a lot more of them. Seth continued. Each of the particles within the atom is perceptively aware of all of the other particles within that same atom. They move in response to stimuli received from each other and to stimuli that come from other atoms. Each atom within a cell, for example, is aware of the activity of each of the other atoms there, and to some extent of the stimuli that come to the cell itself from outside it. Perceptions in general physical terms usually seem to involve information picked up from an arbitrarily designated structure, of an event seemingly occurring in another structure outside of itself. In the entire act of perception, however, there is a oneness and a unity between the seemingly objectively perceived event and the perceiver. The entire act has its own electromagnetic reality, and the event is actually electromagnetic motion. The movement within the atoms mentioned earlier is therefore basically a part of the entire perceived event. Does this make the issue plainer for you? Yes. Egotistically, you make arbitrary designations of necessity, perceiving only portions of any given action. Again, the ego attempting to separate itself from overall action, and to see itself as an entirely independent structure. See the excerpts from the 242nd session. You may take your break. To go into modern knowledge of the components of the atom can be a very complicated task, so I'll note only that such particles are regarded as actually being packets of energy, or quote-unquote probability patterns, that can also manifest themselves as waves. Both the particle and the wave aspects are legitimate in space-time. An atom, then, is composed of a quote-unquote heavy, positively charged nucleus orbited by quote-unquote lighter, negatively charged electrons. Generally speaking, these positive and negative qualities could be those Seth referred to in the 464th session. The electron is the lightest particle known to have mass and charge, and its internal structure, whatever it may be, is unknown. The atomic nucleus is largely made up of more massive protons and neutrons, but investigation within the nucleus has either uncovered or produced many other subatomic particles as well. Over 200 of these, some of them very unstable, are presently known. According to Seth, of course, all of the particles or probability patterns discussed here would be composed of the much, much smaller CUs, or units of consciousness. In Volume 1, see Note 4 for Session 682, and Session 702, see the material on electron spin, and Note 6. Note 5 for that session also contains applicable references. End of footnote. This, in turn, sends out its ripples, so that, as you know, the most minute action is felt everywhere. From here on, I'll start occasionally presenting excerpts from a few of the sessions Jane has delivered in her ESP class. Footnote. Jane held her first ESP class on the evening of September 12th, 1967, although she didn't let Seth come through within that format until the following December, so cautious was she in taking that psychic step. She had no personal experience or other precedent to go by. Her How to Develop Your ESP Power had been published in 1966, but she was still experimenting with her own abilities, even as she is now. It could also be said that at issue was the whole question of first-hand public interaction with and acceptance or rejection of Seth and his material. Classes were quite small for some time, although they'd grown considerably by the end of 1969. After the Seth material was published in 1970, class became well known enough to start attracting visitors from various parts of the country. It still does so. Class Seth material and other events can be found in all of the books by Jane and or Seth, of course. See, for example, Chapter 13 of the Seth material, the Appendix of Seth Speaks, and several chapters in Part 1 of Adventures in Consciousness. A note added later. Jane's ESP Power was originally issued by Frederick Fell Publishers, Incorporated. Pocket Books reprinted it in 1976 as a paperback and with a new title, The Coming of Seth. In Volume 1, see Note 2 of the preface by Seth. End of footnote. I've saved some of this material for a considerable time. More often than not, I wasn't present when Seth produced his material, and in all cases it was recorded by students. Jane meets with them on Tuesday evening, when I'm usually occupied typing Monday night's private session, or book material, often from my own notes. Class offers an extremely rich learning environment for Jane as well as her students, since in this appendix the focus is primarily upon the relationship involving Jane Rupert Seth. However, I can only write here that many other developments of great interest to us, Jane's Samari songs and poetry, for instance, had their origins within the class framework. From the ESP class session for February 16th, 1971, I come through so forcefully for several reasons. Because that is the way I am, in the guise that I choose to use in my communications, and to get everyone over the idea that so-called spirits must be sweet-faced, quiet, sober, and dignified. That, for example, is one of my main concerns. I also want each of you to understand that energy is being used, and that the underlined same energy Rupert uses is available to underlined each of you, with much good humor. For all those who have in their deepest, most sacred thoughts imagined that to be quiet was good and to be dignified was pious, then such a performance as mine should certainly make them think. The voice mechanism, unfortunately, is something that we must work with, and to get my own personality across through the female image and vocal cords, certain adjustments must be made. Beyond this, however, as I have mentioned before in class, it is not out of the inner sense of my invisible heart, but out of the depths of your own psychologies that you make me into a wise old man. and project upon me the authority images that lurk in your own minds. I have always tried to keep you from making this error, and sought to release from within yourselves your own abilities. To a particular student, I remain spontaneous and alive, and do not allow myself to be deadened by your projections upon me. I have a cosmopolitan accent, not sophisticated, but cosmopolitan. Underlined, you have an accent to me. Amused, I have spoken many tongues, and in translation, this voice is what it ends up as, and so we are all stuck with it. Now continue. From the ESP class session for April 20th, 1971. I am very afraid to tell all of you that I have forgotten what I consider to be secrets through the lives I have lived. I certainly know that, like any of you, I have not always been charitable in the past. I know that I have hated one parent or another. I know, certainly, that once I plundered in the wages of war. I do not come to you as someone who does not know what it is like to be human, and in those personality characteristics that I use when I speak to you, I show you that the emotional life continues. Footnote. Although in that 1971 class Seth stressed his experiences with the human condition through reincarnation, in 1964 he'd had this to say. To me, this reincarnational and family material is also obvious that I almost hesitate to mention it, but this is because I tend to forget what human experience on your plane actually involves. End quote. See the excerpts from the 27th session in this appendix. In that early session, Seth spoke to me alone. In class, he faced a large group. I'd say that from his position or focus as an energy personality essence, both attitudes are true, rather than contradictory, and that one or the other predominated according to the circumstances and subject matter of the session involved. I don't think the time gap between the two sessions, 7 years, was a factor. End of footnote. Now my relationship with you and Rupert is indeed a strange one, since you do not relate to me as you do to each other. The, I hope, delightfully human egotistical characteristics that I show help calm your fears and show you that the self as you think of it continues to exist after physical death. I have a reservoir of personality banks upon which I can draw, and as a teacher I use the one that is most effective in any given system of reality. This is the one I use here. It is a portion of myself that is the most closely connected with earthly existence, and it is a self that I liked very well indeed. I very seldom speak symbolically to you. I speak as literally as possible, but in order that any information may appear within your three-dimensional system, translations of it through Rupert are automatically necessary, or you would not perceive it. In July 1971, Jane began a book to be called Adventures in Consciousness, based on the experiences of her students in ESP class. Within a few days, Seth mentioned it while dictating Chapter 21 of Seth Speaks. See the 587th session. Class was now providing a wealth of material on reincarnation, various states of consciousness, and out-of-body travel. It was also bombarding Jane with questions for which she found no acceptable answers. Her own intuitive experiences were accelerating, and these, she felt, were more and more outgrowing the ordinary concepts of psychology. Jane was particularly bothered by people's attitudes about Seth, for they often considered him as a quote-unquote spirit guide in conventional spiritualistic terms. Though almost 8 years had passed since Seth had first come through, she'd known for some time that she wanted to explore the whole phenomenon more deeply. Jane believed Seth when he told us he was an energy personality essence, no longer focused in physical reality, end quote. She just wanted to know more about what he meant by that statement. She was certain, she wrote, that far more than Seth's being a spirit guide was involved, that, quote, in larger terms, the abilities of living personality are connected with other facets of creative consciousness, end quote. Now I'll refer the reader to Note 6 for session 711, which is the session for which I'm assembling this chronology to begin with. In that note, I presented some material on ancient connections with the name Seth, then quoted Seth on the subject of names from the ESP class session for April 17th, 1973. For instance, I told Rupert from our earliest sessions that he could call me Seth. I never said, quote, my name underlined is Seth, for I am nameless. I have had too many identities to cling to one name. At the end of Note 6 are a few references to some of Seth's reincarnational names as he gave them while dictating Seth Speaks. A reference not given there is the 541st session for Chapter 11 of Seth Speaks. That session contains information and notes relevant to the concurrent lives that Jane, Seth, and I lived in Denmark in the 1600s. As mentioned at the beginning of this appendix, even though I'm considering the Jane-Rupert-Seth relationship, I want to avoid becoming too enmeshed within the intertwining connections several personalities would experience in any one set of lives. Such particulars would lead too far away from the focus chosen here. Jane and I would rather explore specific reincarnational information in an outright book on the subject, and then only after we'd acquired much more personal and theoretical material. We do think that in detail, reincarnation, whether it's seen in ordinary terms or within the quote-unquote simultaneous framework espoused by Seth, can be an endless subject. Footnote. Concerning reincarnation, as well as books on the subject, here's Seth from the 588th session in Chapter 22 of Seth Speaks, quote, now when I began contacting Rupert and Joseph, I hid from them the fact of my numerous lives. Smile. Rupert, in particular, did not accept reincarnation, and the idea of such multiple life experiences would have been highly scandalous to him. The times and names and dates are not nearly as important as the experiences, and they are too numerous to list here. However, I will see to it at some time that these are made fully available. In a book on reincarnation, I hope to have each of my previous personalities speak for themselves, for they should tell their own stories. End quote. Seth said a lot in that last sentence, of course, but that just means that more questions than usual come to mind. Although Jane and I think his idea for such a book is unique, we haven't done anything to implement it, nor have we asked him to explain further. Just how would Seth propose to have his quote-unquote previous personalities speak for themselves? Since Seth presumably wouldn't simply relay such messages, would Jane find herself giving voice for a host of others, male and female, young and old, from many time periods and of the most diverse nationalities? A long project, and one for which she would use her abilities in new ways. End of footnote. From my notes at the close of the 700th session for May 29th, 1974 in Volume 1, quote, in our case, Seth said a bit later, Rupert almost, quote-unquote, becomes the material he receives from me. If certain other beneficial alterations occur, and further understanding on Rupert's part, we may be able to meet at underlined other levels of consciousness. In the dream state, when he is not cooperating in the production of our book material, end quote. For Jane has never met Seth face-to-face, you might say, in a dream. The closest she's come to this situation is in giving a session for him in the dream state, as she does in waking life. From the ESP class session for July 16th, 1974. In certain terms, then, you cannot separate yourselves from me, as Rupert cannot, nor can I separate myself from you. We are all portions of an event that is taking place within the universe, and the universe is acquainted with all of its parts. When one part of the universe speaks, then all parts speak. When one portion of the universe dies, all portions die. But in your terms, to get into the kind of life you know again, you must exit from space and time so that you can re-enter it. Now, I can be playful because I am not as serious and mystical as the rest of you. I am myself, and if you were yourselves, you would not be so self-consciously profound about your beliefs in the nature of your reality. Footnote. Seth's remarks here are actually an extension of a long discussion on individual beliefs and spontaneity that he'd initiated in a class session 2 weeks ago. Quote, "Now, my words will not, I hope, be used to begin a new dogma. Underlined, my dogma is the freedom of the individual. My emphasis. My dogma is the sacrilegious one, that each of you is a good individual. There is nothing wrong with your emotions or feelings or being. When you know yourself, then you are joyfully responsive. And being joyfully responsive, you can carry your society to the furthest reaches of its creativity." End quote. End of footnote. Humorously, to a certain student, "You would trust your mustache." Oh boy. I love it. In the opening notes for the 708th session in this volume 2, I wrote that Jane finished Adventures in August 1974. She'd started it in July 1971, as noted a few paragraphs ago, but there was never any straight line of activity for her on the book from beginning to end. She finished Seth Speaks. Then, during a class in November 1971, she first gave voice to her trance language, Samari. So besides the other class material, she had several more stages of consciousness, if very dependable ones, to deal with in Adventures. At the same time, she worked on her autobiography, From This Rich Bed, which still isn't done. At times, the creative pace grew even more complicated. From March to July 1972, she put Adventures aside completely to write her novel, The Education of Oversoul 7, when that idea spontaneously came to her. But overall, Jane discovered that she was frustrated in dealing with class experiments and records for Adventures, while she still had so much to learn about her own connections with Seth. More than ever, she needed larger concepts of reality to explain her experiences, those of her students, and of some who wrote. Shortly after Jane finished 7, the entire idea for what she calls aspect psychology came to her, an intuitive construct, that's in quotes, that she thought was large enough to contain her experience. At one sitting, she wrote 20 or so pages of material in which she understood her relationship with Seth, Seth 2, the Samari, the characters in 7, and other psychic concepts, as well, all as aspects of a larger self that was independent of space and time. The aspects represented the dynamics of personality. As Jane wrote, she realized that the questions she had been struggling with in Adventures had triggered a new psychology, a new way of approaching the creative portions of human personality. The material itself, of course, came from another state of consciousness. Emphasis on another state of consciousness. And this Jane called her quote-unquote aspects channel. More on aspects came to her spontaneously at intervals during the next 2 years. Throughout this period, she did a great deal of other work. Besides holding class and continuing Rich Bed, she produced in their entirety Dialogues, Personal Reality, Volume 1 of Unknown Reality, and started Volume 2. Toward the end of this period, the Aspects channel began opening up regularly, providing further refinements on her original inspirations. And Jane put it all together. The class experiments she'd started out with in 1971 and all of the later material became Adventures in Consciousness, an introduction to aspect psychology. For part 2 of that book, I drew 16 diagrams to illustrate her theories. As she probed the Jane Rupert-Seth relationship in Adventures, Jane found herself developing her own nomenclature, separate from Seth's, for many of the concepts she and Seth had experienced over the years. Quote, "But I didn't plan it that way," she said. "That's the way it all came out." She calls the conscious self the quote-unquote focused personality, for instance, since it's focused in this physical camouflage reality. The focused personality is composed of aspects of the quote-unquote source self, or entity. Each aspect exists independently, in its own dimension of actuality, but the aspects' combined attributes form the basic components of the selves that we know. To Jane, Seth is a quote-unquote personogram, an actual personality formed in the psyche at the intersection point of the focus personality with another aspect. Seth, then, would be a message from the source self, except that in this case, the messenger is the message, formed into a richly, quote-unquote, worded psychological structure instead of into dry words on, say, a telegram. Seth in sessions would stand for Jane's Seth aspect, who does indeed exist in a different kind of reality than ours. But that quote-unquote invisible Seth would send out an actual psychological structure that takes over in place of Jane's, as her own structure voluntarily steps aside during sessions. Earlier in this appendix, see the excerpts on the psychological bridge from the 242nd session. From the ESP class session for September 24th, 1974. The excitement of living must come from each of you, and not from me. You come here to know yourselves, and that should always be your purpose. I can help you. I can help you. But I am not the person you search for. Underlined, you are the person you search for. Are the person you search, underlined, for. The dimensions of your reality are the important points, in certain terms, and in certain terms only, and speaking now as the psychological bridge personality, then what you perceive in me and these abilities represents a portion of Rupert that is utterly free in those directions. A portion of the human mind, as you understand it, goes beyond the threshold of itself into other dimensions of actuality. Then, as best it can, it translates what it learns, sees, and experiences. It goes out of itself. It launches itself on paths that it does not understand, taking journeys that even Rupert does not understand. And yet, that one portion of Rupert's human personality is underlined that free. And so you can see what happens. And so you can see what happens. The following excerpt is from an ESP class session that Seth delivered 3 months after the 711th session, which inspired this appendix, was held on October 9th, 1974. As noted much earlier, the chronology for our study of the Jane-Rupert-Seth relationship, quote, begins long before unknown reality was started and continues well beyond the date of its ending in April 1975, end quote. Very soon, then, the quotations to come reach beyond that date. They're usually short and are from a mixture of class, regular, and private or quote-unquote deleted sessions. With an exception or two, they contain material that ordinarily might not have been published for several years, if ever. Let's see here. The Kindle app currently says that 1 hour, 11 minutes remain left in the chapter. It's currently 4:44 p.m. Eastern Time as I am broadcasting this live. And we could go for maybe another 45 minutes at the most. So perhaps we'll go until about 5:15 or so and then call it a day. I guess this appendix is literally so long we won't even get through all of it alone in one sitting, but that's okay. It's not like we're in some hurry to get through the entire book. Although that said, I can tell you from experience, the next book we'll be reading, the next Seth book, The Nature of the Psyche, is quite interesting. So to continue. But all of them contribute insights into the subject under consideration. From the ESP class session for January 7th, 1975. Rupert can do many things that surprise me, that I did not do in my past. For remember that fresh creativity emerges from the past also, as in Rupert's novel, Oversoul 7. Footnote. See Chapter 17 of Oversoul 7, for instance. In Personal Reality, Seth discussed, quote-unquote, a sort of reprogramming of the past. See Session 653 through 54 in Chapter 14. A note added later. That January 1975 class session is an excellent one in many respects, and Jane presented much of it in Chapter 15 of her Psychic Politics. Although Seth finished his work on both volumes of Unknown Reality well before Jane was through with Politics, the latter was published first, and that chronology is treated in my introductory notes for Volume 1. End of footnote. My memory does not include a predetermined past in which Rupert exists. He can do things that did not happen in my memory of that existence and did not, in fact, occur. Now that is a quote-unquote mind-blowing statement, and it applies to each of you. It is important in terms of your own understanding of yourself and the nature of time. The following exchange between Seth and a student, Bill, say, took place in the ESP class for February 18th, 1975. Seth had been discussing certain psychic aspects of a rather complicated experience involving Jane, myself, and a house. Then he said, "We all learn, as each of us experiences, in certain terms, again, and underlined only in my relationship to Rupert and Joseph, as Seth calls Jane and me. I am a future Rupert, but only in terms of that relationship, as I may be an uncle to someone here, and an aunt to someone there, an ancestor to someone else, and a descendant of still another person, or, as underlined, you might be." Bill: "So, in other words, you had this house information, and you're somehow being reminded of it again through the experience of Rupert, because you had it through another life?" Not in that way at all. That experience of Rupert's and Joseph's was completely new. I was, in those terms, underlined, not the Rupert that Rupert underlined is. My experiences as Rupert were different, and Rupert's experiences as Seth in those terms will be different. Rupert will be a different Seth than I am. Footnote. In this appendix, see the excerpts from sessions 54 and 58. End of footnote. Bill: "But you did experience this house event in order to say it through Rupert." I did not experience it. Rupert experienced it. I commented on Rupert's experience. In his experience, Rupert is also free enough so that he can open up certain channels of his mind that then comment upon his activity. Some of those channels led to underlined my reality, but I am not some spooky big brother experiencing his reality for him. The 768th session was held on March 22nd, 1976, 11 months after Seth had finished dictating Unknown Reality. Originally, Jane and I deleted the following rather personal material from the session, yet we present it here because in it Seth explores further the connections involving the three of us. My notes at the time show that I was also distinctly surprised by Seth's comments on his emotional behavior at his own quote-unquote level of activity. But I soon understood my reaction as a sign that we still had things to learn about him, as well as ourselves. In one passage, Seth referred to some health difficulties, now resolved, that had bothered me just before our sessions with him began. To me: "You have often said that the Seth books were Rupert's. That is true. Yet to a certain degree it is also a simplification. Rupert's experience is obviously intertwined with yours. My characteristics, as they are displayed through the Seth personality, therefore, come from you as well as Rupert. Triggers were needed also to initiate my emergence into your world through that personality I display. Rupert's own background and questions were highly vital as such initiating principles. Your questions merged with his. It was the practical impetus underlined of your need at the time, however, that operated as the final emotional trigger. You recall the circumstances." Footnote. Quote unquote, "In late 1963, Jane wrote in Chapter 2 of the Seth material, some months before our sessions began, we'd taken a vacation in York Beach, Maine, hoping that a change of environment would improve Rob's health. The doctor didn't know what was wrong with his back and suggested that he spend some time under traction in the hospital. Instead, we decided that his reaction to stress was at least partially responsible, hence this trip. By then I'd lost, and that's the end of that quotation. Also, hello there, Ryan. Good to see you here. By then I'd lost many months from my job as a commercial artist, which was work I'd returned to several years earlier to help ease our financial pressures. I was 44 years old, and as I recognized after the sessions began, at a point in life where I greatly needed more penetrating insights into the meaning of existence. So did Jane, even though she was almost 10 years younger. As the sessions became part of our joint reality, we gradually came to understand that the illness I struggled with was a disguised expression of rebellion for both of us. We were very dissatisfied with our status quo. After years of work, Jane had managed to publish but a few poems and a few pieces of science fantasy, several short stories, and 2 brief novels. And in my own view, I wasn't making it as the kind of artist I wanted to be. We were driven to know more about art, about writing, about the human condition, about everything. My own need, as well as Jane's, struck deep responses within her psyche. For an account of what happened to us at York Beach on that trip, see more of Chapter 2 and the Seth material. Also see Note 6 for Session 680 in Volume 1. End of footnote. Dear Mr. Poetic, I hope you are doing well, staying healthy. Thank you, Ryan. I hope you are as well in these troubled times of COVID-19 plaguing us across the land. I seem to be staying as healthy as I can. I'm exercising great caution with this virus. I did feel a little under the weather early this morning for some reason, but it seems to have faded away. I'm not sure what that was all about. Probably just my allergies acting up. But yeah, I hope you're staying healthy as well in these dark times in which we live. All right, so where were we? Rupert provided himself with a background in which a parent, Jane's mother, was steadily, chronically ill, and in which the medical profession with its beliefs was in constant sight. That's a sort of weird synchronicity there. But footnote. In Volume 1, see Session 679 with its Note 4, among others, for material on Jane's early years with her mother. I often remind myself that from her earliest years, Jane lived in an atmosphere permeated by the fact of illness, while by contrast, my background in that respect was much more ordinary. Growing up, she was, quote unquote, frightened most of the time, Jane told me as I prepared this note. She often lived alone with her bedridden mother, such periods being punctuated by a succession of itinerant housekeepers appointed by the welfare department. She soon became strongly imprinted by human frailty and vulnerability. Yet, we fully agree with Seth that like any other personality, Jane chose her physical environment before birth, planning to meet certain challenges within that setting. End of footnote. Well, tomorrow I go in for a stomach x-ray procedure. Also, my job is still ongoing, so 10 to 12-hour days each shift. Oh, wow, that is brutal. But I missed a lot of days due to battling a chronic sickness of my own and going back and forth to doctor meetings. Oh, man. That sounds stressful as hell, Ryan. Damn. And you're still going to work, even with the pandemic going on. Well, wow. Kudos to you. It takes a lot of it takes a lot of courage to brave that at this time. And I hope your stomach x-ray goes well. Health problems. I know I'm no stranger to them. And it's like well, I don't know about you, but for me, it's like you have to get to this point. You have to come to this point where you're just like, well, you just have to do it. You just have to through the crap, let the medical professionals do what they have to do. And it's no fun, but in my experience, I find it's just far easier to kind of accept it and, integrate it into my overall reality rather than resist it, but at the same time, sometimes it can be hard not to resist it. Carpentry work. I went from concrete to building houses. I see. Everything from the foundation to finishing the roof and putting side onto the exterior walls. Yeah, that's some intense stuff right there, it sounds like. Well, I hope things go well for you, sir. His mother was not medically neglected. His background included far more than sickness and the medical profession, however, but Rupert knew that the conventional medical framework was not the answer to human ills. As you became more and more incapacitated, the trigger was set to find another solution. Psychic structures interweave, and realities underlined due one through the other, as Jane had written a few hours before the session. With a smile, my personality, as it so richly presents itself, is louder, underlined, to some extent a joint creation of the two of you. This does not mean that I do not have my own reality, for I do, but in my relationship with you and Rupert and with your world, I do take certain characteristics that come from each of your realities. You two do not understand how alike you are. Rupert is as quote-unquote detailed about his own working habits as you both admit you are in yours. He seems to be in awe, relatively speaking, of your simplified quote-unquote perfectionist detailed ways, while to a certain extent you seem to be equally awed by his inspired, underlined, undetailed ways, a game each of you plays. Wait a minute, so what's Seth saying here exactly? So he's saying Rupert is as detailed about his own working habits. You both admit you are in yours. Rupert seems to be in awe, so Jane seems to be in awe of I guess, Rob's perfectionist detailed ways, while to a certain extent Rob seems to be equally awed by Jane's inspired undetailed ways. It's kind of funny. Just good, honest work. Thank you, Mr. Poetic, you too. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, good, honest work. I bet that's the kind that feels the best at the end of the day. All right, so let's see. Underlined, in your terms, I am relatively unemotional at my own level of activity. Rather, my emotional behavior does not follow your patterns. That is closer to, quote unquote, the truth. I have long delegated your kind of emotional activity to what you would call unconscious behavior. Our focuses are different, yet the overall coloration of your experiences does come through to me, and through this delightful personality, Jane indicated herself, I can, to some extent, relate to it. You set upon this adventure, the two of you. It is meaningless to say that the books are Rupert's. Your ideas of quote-unquote perfection and love of detail, or if you prefer, your feeling for the significance of detail that appears underlined exteriorized in your notes, is as present in the inner consistency of the material itself as given by me. Rupert keeps track of intuitive details that neither of you are even conscious of, and so there shows an integrity that at least sometimes he is not aware of. You yourselves adopt personalities, though usually you are not aware of doing so. So underlined, I adopt a personality that can communicate with your own. Footnote. See Seth in the excerpts from the ESP class session for April 20th, 1971. Quote, I have a reservoir of personality banks upon which I can draw. End quote. End of footnote. In one manner of speaking, mine is heroic, larger, and multidimensional. On the other hand, I can operate only mentally in your world. It is Rupert who must walk down the street. From the 775th session for May 10th, 1976. Bits of your consciousness, Joseph and Rupert, go out through these books. Footnote. Since Jane and I equate the quote-unquote bits of consciousness mentioned in this excerpt with Seth's EE, electromagnetic energy units, and his CUs, units of consciousness, see the references listed in Note 3 for Appendix 12. End of footnote. I am not speaking symbolically. Those portions will mix with the consciousness of others. Portions of your intent and purpose become theirs. My own psychological reality is not particleized. My identity includes the identities of many others, and they each operate in their own fashion. In those terms, I am a wave formation. More specifically, however, and to a lesser degree, each physical person operates partially as a particleized being, and partially in terms of a wave. Footnote. Seth's material in this excerpt reminded me strongly of certain passages of his and mine in the 702nd session in Volume 1. Quote, as long as you think in terms of subatomic particles, you are basically off the track, or even when you think in terms of waves. The idea of interrelated underlined fields comes closer, of course, yet even here you are simply changing one kind of term for one like it, only slightly different. In all of these cases, you are ignoring the reality of consciousness and its gestalt formation and manifestations. Until you perceive the innate consciousness behind any quote-unquote visible or invisible manifestations, then you put a definite barrier to your own knowledge. End quote. Then in my note at 10:20, I wrote, I thought it very interesting that Seth talked about subatomic waves and particles in the last paragraphs of his delivery tonight. Correction, last paragraph of his delivery tonight. Such ideas involve the physicist's ongoing conception of the duality of nature. For instance, is light made up of waves or particles? A contemporary accommodation called complementarity leads experimenters to accept results that show either aspect to be true. End quote. Since Seth obviously sees little real difference between the concepts of fields and waves/particles, I'd say that in the 775th session, he cast his material in accord with the latter so as to make it as clear as possible to us who are so bound by ideas of space and time. Quote, in those terms, end quote. But overall, the physicists discuss energy, and Seth talks about consciousness, and therein, as I see it, lies the basic contrast between the two approaches to reality. Apropos of that quote-unquote reality of consciousness quoted above from the 702nd session, Seth also came through with the following more generalized material in session 775. Quote, you are actually quote-unquote reincarnated many times during one accepted lifetime. There are often great challenges to which you respond. You pick these for your own reasons. In doing so, you often change affiliations. Consciousness forms patterns of identities. They move faster than the speed of light. They can be in more than one place at one time. See notes 5 and 6 for session 702. They can operate in a freewheeling fashion as identities in themselves or as quote-unquote psychological particles. They can also operate in a wave-like fashion, flowing through other such particles. They can form together into endless infinite combinations, forming psychological gestalts. Certain portions of these gestalts can then operate as quote-unquote psychological particles in time and space, while other portions operate in a wave-like manner outside of time and space. These represent the unconscious elements of the species, which become quote-unquote particleized in physical existence, end quote. All right, well, after 2 hours and 4 minutes, I finally need to switch arms. Although these final paragraphs from the 775th session contain many ideas, I want to stress two of them that I find especially evocative. Seth's reference to many incarnations in one accepted lifetime, and the unconscious elements of the species being represented by its wave-like characteristics. Since this session was held almost 13 months after Unknown Reality was completed, I can look back and note that Seth developed the statement on reincarnation in his material on counterparts. This begins with session 721 in section 5. Appendix 21 grew out of that session. In that same section, the 725th session with note 4 contains additional information on particles, identities, and psychological gestalts. End of footnote. But identity, being itself inviolate, is on the other hand ever-changing, and there is, in the larger framework of reality, no contradiction. Jane stopped holding ESP class on a regular basis early in 1975. The rhythm of those weekly gatherings was broken when we gave up apartment living to move into our own house in March of that year. In spite of our good intentions, class in the old sense was never resumed, as we became more and more involved with producing Seth's and Jane's books, painting, correspondence, and all of the other events that make up our daily lives. The following material came through during a session on March 11th, 1977, when a group of former students assembled to hear Seth speak, quote-unquote, for old time's sake. Now, I do not mind being non-scientific, and neither do any of you mind, because if all of your realities were confined to scientific theories, you would have no realities at all, and neither would your fine scientists. Footnote. Many passages in Appendix 12 and in its notes could be quoted to illuminate Seth's comments here. Notes 13 and 20 are examples, and their superscription numbers can be used as references to the appropriate paragraphs in the appendix itself. In general, I suggest reviewing the last few pages of Appendix 12, beginning with my own material. Quote, my position after writing this appendix is ... end quote. End of footnote. And in my time, I was also quite a dogmatic scientist. The times were different, however, and then I was even more intolerant in my beliefs than your scientists generally underlined are today. In the terms of my book, Unknown Reality, I was a dream art scientist, but I was very dogmatic, and I demanded that others follow underlined my symbols and not their own. Footnote. In Volume 1, see Session 700, Seth at 953, quote, the true art of dreaming is a underlined science, long forgotten by your world. Such an art, pursued, trains the mind in a new kind of consciousness, one that is equally at home in either exterior or interior existence, well grounded and secure in each, end quote. And from Session 704, quote, the dream art scientist, the true mental physicist, the complete physician, such designations represent the kinds of training that could allow you to understand the unknown, and therefore the known reality, and so become aware of the blueprints that exist beyond the physical universe. End quote. End of footnote. And that is why I now so carefully tell you to follow your own ways. Finally, I'll close this appendix with a couple of quotations from Seth that I return to again and again. These in turn led to a last note. In Chapter 3 of Seth Speaks, see the 519th session for March 23rd, 1970. I need a sip of water. When I enter your system, I move through a series of mental and psychic events. You would interpret these events as space and time, and so often I must use the terms, for I must use your language rather than my own. In one way, I translate what I am into an event that you can understand to some extent. Footnote. Apropos of his quotations from Seth Speaks, here's what Seth had to say in a later personal session, quote, there are rhythms that exist over a period of time, as I have mentioned before, and had you the leisure to check your records, you would see that overall we have about the same number of sessions each year. There are many cycles involved, some connected with the two of you, with myself, or with other conditions quite apart. Yeah, there's one thing I've learned through astrology, it's that our entire reality is pretty much made up of cycles. Everything is a cycle, cycles within cycles, endless cycles within endless cycles. Some of these conditions could be called the result of psychological atmospheres that surround the Earth. Say, I do not travel physically in a UFO, with amusement, and yet my mental or psychic journeys must occur in a medium of some kind. There are rhythmic activities in that atmosphere that I count upon and use, as for example, a sea captain might use the rhythm of the waves for his voyages. Those inner atmospheric quote unquote waves have a certain regularity. They are more intense at certain times than others. End quote. End of footnote. Oh, and that's it. Wow, that's perfect timing, actually. I was just about to wrap up the stream because we're approaching our time limit, and I'll need a few minutes to close it out properly. Yeah, that's it. There's so many notes to this session that the whole rest of the section here is made up of the notes. So let me first of all give you guys a bit of a preview for what we will experience next time. I don't physically travel via UFO for my own amusement. And I thought that was funny. Yeah, funny enough, this session ended up being so long, or this appendix 18, that the actual material on flying saucers that I put in the title for the stream, we won't get to until Appendix 20, which I thought we were going to get to today because I didn't realize how long Appendix 18 was before I began the stream. So I guess we'll have to wait until next week, or who knows, maybe 2 weeks from now for that. I don't know. But next week, when we get to at least Appendix 19, this is what we can expect. It says, Appendix 19, a discussion of Seth 2 and Jane's quote-unquote long sounds session, black holes, time reversal, and related subjects. And that, of course, is also where I got the black holes part of the stream title. So I'll have to change the stream title after this to reflect the material that we actually covered. Pictures of Martian UFOs from Mars attacks. I haven't seen that, but it sounds like I should. Kind of reminds me of that. What was it? War of the Worlds or whatever, that radio broadcast that fooled a bunch of people many years ago, but like 100 years ago or something. I don't know when that was, but anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I will be back later this evening with various tarot forecasts for the month of April. And after that, I'll be back Wednesday afternoon, likely around 3 p.m. Eastern time for a tarot card analysis stream. I'll be looking at the Eight of Wands. Then I'll be back on Friday for another astrology basics stream, new series I just started. You can learn the basics of astrology with me if you like. We'll be looking at the moon that day. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I'll be back that evening at 7 p.m. Eastern time for a live tarot reading for donation of any amount stream, where you can come by and donate as little as $1, and I'll be happy to give you a tarot reading on any subject of your choice. So yeah, that's about it. There may be some unplanned streams that crop up from time to time in the near future as well, but I kind of really, on the other hand, I kind of really got to get these April forecasts out of the way first before I have time for any let us say extracurricular activities, I suppose. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Coming to you here from a very cloudy, rainy, gloomy late March afternoon, or I guess technically now it's early evening. So yeah, I do wish I could see some more nice days around here, but that's what we have. Let's see, it's Tim Burton film. I see. A nice, hopefully I can catch those streams. Due to my hours working, I probably won't be attending too many streams in the future, but I'm sure you understand. Oh yeah, don't worry about it, Ryan. I totally understand. I'm just glad that people show up here when they do, like when they're able to. I'm thankful that you showed up here. Thank you very, very much. I do appreciate it. Livening up the stream with some commentary. That's always fun, makes it a lot more interesting than just me sitting here reading the entire time and with my brief commentary, I guess. So, yeah, thank you so much for watching. And I will see you later, particularly if you are a Taurus, Gemini, or Cancer. I'll probably get through more or less those signs tonight for the April tarot forecast. So, um, thank you again, and have a great night, everyone.